Okay, 2 Samuel 18. Well, I'm in 1 Samuel. Second Samuel 18. Verse 1, it says, And David numbered the people that were with him, and he set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. And David sent forth a third part of the people under the hand of Joab, and a third part under the hand of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and a third part under the hand of Ittai, the Gittite. And the king said unto the people, I will surely go forth with you myself also. But the people answered, Thou shalt not go forth, for if we flee away, they will not care for us, neither if half of us die will they care for us. But now thou art worth 10,000 of us. Therefore now it is better that thou succor us out of the city. And the king said unto them, What seemeth you best, I will do. And the king stood by the gate side, and all the people came out by hundreds and by thousands. And the king commanded Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, Deal gently for my sake with the young man, even with Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave all the captains charge concerning Absalom. And so the people went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was in the wood of Ephraim, where the people of Israel were slain before the servants of David. And there was a great slaughter that day of 20,000 men, for the battle was there scattered over the face of all the country, and the wood devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. And Absalom met the servants of David, and Absalom rode upon a mule, and the mule went under a thick bough of a great oak, and his head caught hold of the oak, and he was taken up between the heaven and the earth, and the mule that was under him went away. And a certain man saw it, and told Joab, and said, Behold, I saw Absalom hanged in an oak. And Joab said unto the man that told him, And behold, thou sawest him, why didst thou not smite him there to the ground? And I would have given thee 10 shekels of silver and a girdle. And the man said unto Joab, Though I should receive 1,000 shekels of silver in mine hand, yet would I not put forth mine hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king charged thee, and Abishai and Ittai, saying, Beware that none touch the young man Absalom. Otherwise I should have wrought falsehood against mine own life, for there is no matter hid from the king, and thou thyself wouldst have set thyself against me. And then said Joab, I may not tarry thus with thee. And he took 3 darts in his hand, and he thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. And the 10 young men that bare Joab's armor compassed about and smote Absalom and slew him. And Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing after Israel, for Joab held them back. And they took Absalom and cast him into a great pit in the wood, and laid a very great heap of stones upon him. And all Israel fled, every one to his own tent. We'll pause there for a moment. And so we've been building to this chapter for the last few chapters now. And as we've been saying, when you have the kind of actions and events that Absalom was the head of, this was going to turn to a battle. It was inevitable. This is not something that you just peacefully take over a country and expect there to be no bloodshed. I mean, this is just something that doesn't happen. And so the time had now finally come for that inevitable battle between David and Absalom. And so David here, he begins to set his army and organize them properly. And this is, I think, the first part of chapter 18 here shows us a little bit of David's wisdom until he makes a really bad mistake here at the end. But we see here David setting his army and getting them into the proper organization. You see there's captains over hundreds, there's captains over thousands. And then ultimately all of those were split into 3 separate divisions, one led by Joab, one by Abishai, and one by Ittai. Now this man Ittai is the same one a few chapters ago who had come to David, and right as David was fleeing from Absalom, and David originally told him, don't come with me. In fact, he told him, you just got here. You're a foreigner. You just got here yesterday. There's no need for you to come and risk your life for me. And Ittai showed how devoted and how loyal he was to David and to David's cause. And so David not only allowed him to stay, but he made him a captain, one of the 3 captains over his entire army. And so this man garnered a great amount of respect by David in what is relatively a very short time. Now, ultimately, David was going to lead his troops. And I think he probably learned his lesson here with the whole debacle with Bathsheba, because if you remember several chapters ago, he didn't lead his army then. He stayed home. And so his decision here was, I'm going to lead you this particular time. However, the people didn't see it as prudent. And so they knew the truth. This wasn't just a normal battle. This wasn't this nation fighting against this nation for land or whatever the case may be. And if if most of my troops take out most of your troops, obviously you're going to surrender and we're going to win. That's not the case here. They know that Absalom isn't necessarily caring about defeating the majority of David's troops. Absalom is caring about defeating David. And so they tell him, listen, it's not prudent for you to come lead us because you're worth 10,000 of us in this particular battle. Even if we flee, even if they slew half of our army, they won't stop until they get you. And so it's not only safer for you, it's actually safer for us if you don't go. And so here, this is what I was talking about a while ago. David shows why he's such a good leader. He was a man after God's own heart. He was a tremendously wise man. He was wise not only in the affairs of running a nation, he was wise in the affairs of battle and military decisions, but here he shows that he was also a good listener. He was able to take good advice and listen to that advice. And this is what makes a great leader. A great leader is not only a wise man who can make good, wise decisions on their own, but one who is able to understand good counsel when it comes and is humble enough to take that counsel and not say, and not be so prideful to think, no, I have to be the one to make all the decisions. And so David here shows that he was that man. He could see prudent advice, and so he listens, and he stayed behind for the battle. And you would hope that it would have ended there, but then David shows where his blind spot was. And we've already seen this. This isn't new, but David has a blind spot for his family. We've seen this in several stories already. But he tells his commanders, and ultimately we see there in the text that everybody hears this. This wasn't a secret charge. He tells the commanders, and all the army finds out about this. But he tells them to take pity, essentially, on Absalom. Deal gently for my sake with the young man, even with Absalom. However understandable this may be, and you have to kind of split David a little bit in this, because David is, at this moment, a military commander, a king on the run, but he's also a father, right? And so we have to understand where this comes from, but it's not justified, and we have to understand why. And so this is understandable, and I think we can understand and even empathize a little bit with David why he would make such a command. But I like the way that David Payne says this. He says, the truth was that David acted as a father, but not as a king. And so Absalom has not just rebelled against his father. This isn't just a family dispute. This isn't just one son who disagreed with his dad and made a couple of dumb decisions. That's not what this is. Absalom had not just rebelled against David. He had rebelled against his king. He had rebelled against his nation. And in so doing, he had rebelled against his God. And so this is because, this wasn't just a democratically elected ruler. No, this was the man God had put on the throne. To rebel against David's kingship was to rebel against God's will. And so, you could disagree with certain decisions that David made as king, but you could not disagree with the fact that he was king because God had placed him there. And so for Absalom then, again, this isn't just a family dispute. This goes far beyond that. And so David here was unable to separate this. He was unable to say, whereas as a father, I want mercy and I pity my son, but as a king, as a ruler, as the one in charge with making the moral decisions that this country needs to make, Absalom has rebelled against his nation, his king, and his God, and he needs to face the punishment, the righteous punishment for doing so. And understand, I know that's easy to say, much more difficult to carry out. But David, he knows better, and that's kind of the thing. He does know better, and yet he makes this unwise request. Now, we get to the battle itself, and what's interesting is the author of Samuel here isn't very concerned with giving us many details. It's a very a short section concerning the actual battle. We see that it was taking place in verse 6 in the wood of Ephraim, that Absalom's forces take great losses. They lose 20,000. And then in verse 8, it says that the wood devoured more people than the sword. And so they were in a very rough terrain. And ultimately, the terrain did a lot more damage to Absalom's forces than the men of David did. But nevertheless, we don't even get any word of the losses of David. And so the losses of David were apparently quite insignificant, particularly when compared to the 20,000 lost by Absalom. Nonetheless, it was a rout. I mean, that's what the author wants us to understand. And so he gets to the death of Absalom here. And this is where he spends his time. We get several verses on this. And so we see here in verse 9, and Absalom met the servants of David, and Absalom rode upon a mule. And so the scene seems to be suggesting that Absalom, probably leading a group of his own men, they come up upon a group of David's men, and it seems like they're fleeing. That kind of seems to be the gist that we get here, is that Absalom and his men begin to flee. Absalom is riding a mule, and that was considered a very appropriate thing. That wasn't a demeaning thing. Absalom is riding this mule. The mule goes under this tremendous branch of this oak, and Absalom is caught. Now, it doesn't tell us exactly how, and it's funny because this is kind of a big debated thing. People debate exactly how Absalom gets caught in that tree. Some people will say that there was probably a fork in the branch and his head just got caught. To me, it seems rather obvious. The author has set this up for us already several chapters ago. Back in chapter 14, we have a whole verse talking about just how thick and wonderful Absalom's hair was, and how every year he has to shave his hair, and he has just such a great weight of hair because it just grows so fast and it grows so thick, and so it seems to be a very clear setup for what was coming here. And so there was this tremendously thick branch, and you can imagine all the brambles and things that would be there in that particular branch. His hair gets caught in it, and being as thick and hardy, I guess you could say, as his hair was, it gets stuck and gets caught, and it's not difficult at all to imagine that would be strong enough to hold him there. And his mule just keeps walking on, and so he's completely stuck, completely and utterly helpless. You can imagine how terrible of a situation that was, how fearful of a situation that would be. But as the mule goes, there's nothing he can do. And so again, I think the obvious implications is that he was entangled by his hair. Now, one of David's men spots him, and it is interesting the decisions that this man makes. And so we're not told this man's name, but in verse 10, a certain man saw it, and he told Joab. And he said, I saw Absalom hanged in an oak. And so Joab's first question is, you saw him there, why did you not kill him? Joab can't even believe that this man would see Absalom in this very vulnerable position and not take advantage of it. And that's just how Joab thinks. Joab isn't necessarily concerned about what the king commanded. Joab is concerned with what will work. That's what Joab is concerned with. And we see that throughout his life. We'll see that more as we move forward in the book. But this man tells him, no. He said, no, I didn't kill him. He said, first of all, we all heard the king's command. We heard David say, don't touch him. And so not only would this be going against the direct commandment of the king, and he would find out, he specifically says, there is no matter hid from the king. He says, not only do I know that David would find out about this, and I know that it is a direct a disobedience of the king's command, but he said, let's be honest about this. If I did that, David would probably send you to kill me, right? And he's right. I think that's absolutely right. I think David would have done that. We have seen a few times now where David had, in particular, the man who claimed that he killed Saul, even though we know that that's not how it happened. But back in 2 Samuel chapter 1, right, this man comes to David and he says, I saw Saul out in the battlefield. He had been mortally wounded, but he hadn't been killed yet. And he asked me to kill him, so I killed him. And David had that man killed because he stretched forth his hand against God's anointed man. And so I have no doubt in my mind that this man is absolutely right. Right? Not only did David say, don't do it, but Joab, he would have sent you to kill me. Right? There's no reason why I would have done this. And so Joab then takes matters into his own hands, as he does time and time again. And so the text says that he takes 3 darts and he thrusts them into the heart of Absalom. We don't know exactly what is meant by dart. I think probably the most likely option is 3 spears or some kind of spear-like object. And he either throws them or he just, thrusts them in by, whatever the case may be. He pierces Absalom through with these darts. And this probably in of its own would have been a lethal blow. I find it highly doubtful that Absalom would have survived that, given his position, his vulnerability, and the fact that these 3 things went through his heart, right? That alone would have killed him. But Joab, again, is not a man to rest upon maybes or even most likelies. And so we say that the armor bearers of Joab, they come and they smite him. And we don't know how many times. We assume they took out their swords and just began stabbing Absalom to death. That seems to be the case. And so Joab, again, he's not one to just sit back and wait and just say, this will probably happen. No, we're going to make sure it happens. And so Absalom is killed, and thus ends this great rebellion that we've been studying for the past couple of chapters. Now, there's some interesting things that kind of fall out from this, and we'll see this not only the rest of this chapter, but in the coming one as well. But they take Absalom down, and we see, I don't want to say the care, we see the manner in which he is dealt with, his body is concerned. And so they take down his body in verse 17, and it says, and they took Absalom and they cast him into a great pit in the wood, and they laid a very great heap of stones upon him, and all Israel fled everyone to his own tent. And so on the outset, this might sound like a noble, maybe that's the right word. This might sound like a noble burial, but it's really not. When you go back to the book of Judges, you will see that most of the time that they kill a king of one of these pagan nations, this is exactly how they bury them. They take them and they throw them in a pit and they cover them with a big heap of stones. And so this wasn't an honorable burial. This seems to be evidenced or reminiscent of a man that they consider to be cursed. And I think that's also hinted at by the manner in which Absalom died. We know Deuteronomy 21 says, "Curse everyone who hangs on a tree." Well, that quite literally matches the death of Absalom. And so I believe that God orchestrated, I know God orchestrated this, but I believe that God orchestrated this in a manner to show us that the way in which Absalom died was representative of his great sin, which also in line shows us the folly of David's command to say, please show mercy on Absalom. Not only should Absalom not have had mercy shown upon him, but God showed us by the way that he was killed just exactly how serious of a matter it was that Absalom has done this. And so I don't think, again, there's no coincidence here. This wasn't just some accident that, oops, his mule happened to take him and he happened to get caught in this tree and he happened to die by hanging, which Moses specifically said is kind of a curse upon an individual. They didn't just happen to throw him in a pit and bury him with a heap of stones, which is how they buried the pagan kings of old. Right? And so all of this represents that Absalom died in absolute rebellion to God. And in Psalm 55, we get a representation of this. Psalm 55 says, "But thou, O God, shalt bring them down into the pit of destruction. Bloody and deceitful men shall not live out half their days, but I will trust in thee." And so Absalom, to use the Psalm 55 language, didn't live out half his days, and he was brought down into the pit. Right? And so everything about his death points to the fact that he was a rebellious individual. Not just rebellious against David, rebellious against Israel, rebellious against God himself. And so the death, whereas it's this strange and really graphic death, it is fitting for the sinful situation that Absalom had chose to be a part of. And so this was as it should be. And so unlike David, from whom he tried to steal, I spelled that wrong, who tried to steal the kingdom, Absalom would have no line of kings. And this is interesting. Verse 18, we get this kind of one-off verse. It says, "Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and reared up for himself a pillar, which is in the king's dell, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. And he called the pillar after his own name. And it is called unto this day Absalom's place." And so back in chapter 14, that same section where it talks about his hair, it says that he has children, sons included. And so apparently at some point between then and this whole rebellion that took place, Absalom had lost his sons. And so I don't see this to be a contradiction. Some people say, well, see, there's a contradiction. No, there's a very easy explanation for this. He lost his sons, and probably set up this pillar upon losing his sons. That would be my assumption. And so he sets up this pillar, and that is the lasting legacy of Absalom, something that he made, something that stands because he had no sons, he had no line to continue. Now, again, keep that in mind in comparison to David, whom God had already promised not only kingdom, but a line to follow from David. Right? Not only do you have a kingdom, and I'm going to bless that kingdom, but your line will continually sit upon that throne. And it's also interesting in a sense where God has systematically taken out the ones who might have tried at least to make a claim to that throne and to be the one through whom that line would follow. God's already chosen Solomon. We saw that several chapters ago. But now he's had two sons. He's had three sons die, but now he's had two sons who maybe have made a claim to that throne who have died and could no longer make any kind of claim. And so, God is just setting things up for his will to come to pass. We know that, and we understand that. And so this is, and I've said it already, but this is a very fitting end. And that may sound harsh, I understand that. But this is a very fitting end to Absalom because of all the things that he has done. And so we see verse 19. It says, Then said Ahimaaz the son of Zadok, Let me now run and bear the king tidings, how that the Lord hath avenged him of his enemies. And Joab said unto him, Thou shalt not bear tidings this day, but thou shalt bear tidings another day. But this day thou shalt bear no tidings, because the king's son is dead. And then said Joab to Cushai, Go tell the king what thou hast seen. And Cushai bowed himself unto Joab and ran. And then said Ahimaaz the son of Zadok yet again to Joab, But howsoever, let me, I pray thee, run also after Cushai. And Joab said, Wherefore wilt thou run, my son, seeing thou hast no tidings ready? But howsoever said he, Let me run. And so he said unto him, Run. And then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain, and he overran Cushai. And David sat between the two gates, and the watchman went up upon the roof over the gate over the wall. And he lifted up his eyes, and he looked, and behold, a man running alone. And the watchman cried and told the king. And the king said, If he be alone, there is tidings in his mouth. And he came apace and drew near. And the watchman saw another man running. And the watchman called to the porter, and he said, Behold, another man running alone. And the king said, He also bringeth tidings. And the watchman said, Methinketh the running of the foremost is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. And the king said, He is a good man, and he cometh with good tidings. And Ahimaaz called, and he said unto the king, All is well. And he fell down to the earth upon his face before the king. And he said, Blessed be the Lord thy God, which hath delivered up the men that lifted up their hand against the Lord the king. And the king said, Is the young man Absalom safe? And Ahimaaz answered, When Joab sent the king's servant, and me thy servant, I saw a great tumult, but I knew not what it was. And the king said unto him, Turn aside, and he stand here. And he turned aside and stood still. And behold, Cushai came. And Cushai said, Tidings, my lord the king, for the Lord hath avenged thee this day of all them that rose up against thee. And the king said unto Cushai, Is the young man Absalom safe? And Cushai answered, The enemies of my lord the king, and all that rise up against thee to do thee hurt, be as that young man is. And the king was much moved, and he went up to the chamber over the gate, and he wept. And as he went, thus he said, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son. And we're going to see at the beginning of the next chapter where that mourning continues. And Joab's not very happy about it. We'll see that next week. But anyways, the time comes for this news to be sent to David. And of the two volunteers, Joab chooses Cushai. Now, Cushai, the word itself means Cushite, somebody from the nation from Cushai. And so Cushai, that probably more than likely refers to where he's from and not necessarily his name. If it is his name, it's a Cushite name. It's not an Israelite name. So one way or another, this man is a foreigner. And so Joab here, again, shows his practicality. And so here's what he's thinking. I think more than likely here's what he's thinking. We get clues of this. Ahimaaz says, let me run. Let me tell the king what's going on. And Joab tells him specifically in verse 20, he says, I'm not going to send you this day. He says, you shall bear no tidings because the king's son is dead. And so Joab is thinking, David is obviously going to be distraught about this. He already knows, he gave the command not to kill him. And so David's going to be mad about this. I don't want to send you on the off chance that David lashes out. And so he sends Cushai, this foreigner, essentially somebody who Joab probably doesn't care a whole lot if David kills Cushai. He does care if he kills Ahimaaz. And again, you say, well, that sounds harsh. Well, that's just kind of how Joab operates, right? He wants to do what's the most effective. What's the most effective for Joab, and he believes Israel, is if one of these two men has to die, I'd rather it be that man than this man. That's just kind of how Joab operates. And so he sends Cushai, but then Ahimaaz still wants to go. And so Joab probably lets him leave at this point because he thinks he doesn't have enough time to get there, so the bad news will already have been given, and so it doesn't matter if he goes. So he lets him go. And so Ahimaaz takes a different route. Now, that could be evidenced by the fact that he's an Israelite, knows the land better. Whatever the case, one way or another, he takes a different route and he gets there first. And so the watchmen, they're looking out and they inform David, and the author spends a lot of time on this, and he really sets the scene and he gives kind of every detail of this. But the porters, the watchmen, they're looking out and they see individual lone runners. And David rightly assumes if they're alone, they're bringing tidings. And he probably assumes once the watchman says, and essentially one of them looks like Ahimaaz. That's who I think it is. And so David says, let him in, he's a good man. And so David probably is already assuming if Ahimaaz is coming, he has been sent tidings, it's got to be good news. It's got to be a news of victory. However, David also knows that if Ahimaaz is sending news of victory, if I have won, that means bad news for Absalom. That's what he knows. And so Ahimaaz gets there and he proclaims, blessed be the Lord thy God, which hath delivered up the men that lifted up their hand against my lord the king. And notice also the messages of both men. They rightly frame the issue. Cushai more so, but they rightly frame the issue. God did deliver up the men that lifted up their hand against the Lord the king, against David. And that is true, and that is exactly what happened. And so, like I said, this should be great. David should be rejoicing, but he also knows if that's right, then something has either happened to Absalom or at the very least, his forces have been defeated. And so he asks, is the young man Absalom safe? Now here, Ahimaaz just lies. And he basically tells him, he says, when I was leaving, there was a lot of commotion going on, but I don't know what it was about. Now, we know that's a lie because Joab specifically told him, I'm not going to let you go because the king's son is dead. That's what he said in verse 20. And so Ahimaaz knows very surely that Absalom is dead. But he tells David, no, I don't know. Something was going on. Maybe he's not, or maybe he's dead. I just don't know. So he just lies. And so at this time, Cushai arrives, brings the same news, and calls out to David kind of in a similar manner. My lord the king, for the Lord hath avenged thee this day of all them that rose up against thee. Same thing. David again asks him, is the young man safe? And I love the way that Cushai answers this. And this is just kind of a tidbit here. This is another example, and we've seen this a lot over the last several chapters, of a foreigner, not an Israelite, but a foreigner coming in and speaking the truth or doing the right thing. We have seen that time and time again. In fact, we mentioned earlier this chapter Ittai. Ittai was a foreigner who came in, and David said, there's no sense in you coming with me. This is dangerous. You just got here. And Ittai, rather than most of Israel who had followed Absalom, Ittai comes in as foreigner and says, no, I am following you. You are God's man. You're the man to follow. And so we have seen a lot over the last several chapters of these foreigners coming and doing the right thing, saying the right thing. And so Cushai answers, and it's a perfect answer. He said, the enemies of my lord the king, he said, and all that rise against thee to do thee hurt, be as that young man is. Now think about what he could have said. He could have just given a simple yes. He died. Absalom has been killed. But he rightly tells David, first of all, you got to understand that Absalom, like all of those, are your enemy. I know he's your son. I know you're thinking about this as a father, but Absalom is your enemy. And not only that, but Absalom, just like all those that we fought on the battlefield today, are the ones who have risen against you to do you hurt. Right? He's not just your enemy who's going to passively sit by and let you live out your life. No, he's your enemy, and he is against you, and he's trying to do you hurt. And again, David needed to get into this a frame of mind to know that it's not just you individually, but you as representative of God's man for the nation of Israel. And so this is a tremendous rebellion. And so Cushai rightfully tells David that Absalom is an enemy. Absalom is an enemy who's trying to hurt you. And by an enemy who's trying to hurt you, he's an enemy and trying to do hurt against God. And so this is the right way to say this. And so Absalom died as the others did that particular day, as a rebel, as an enemy who intended to do harm, to do hurt to David. And so, again, this is not to try to diminish the pain or the grief that David should feel over the loss of a son. Even if, as a parent, even if you had a child who did some grievous wrong and had a very justified punishment levied against them, that doesn't diminish the pain in losing that person as a child. And so nobody's trying to say, David, you shouldn't mourn over this. David, you shouldn't feel pain over this. But you should understand that it was righteous. And you should understand that what happened today was the right thing. And so David, mentioned this already earlier, but David has now lost a third son, right? He lost the child that he had with Bathsheba, and God took the child. He lost Amnon, and now Absalom. And so he's crying out, right? Oh, Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee. And so here again, we understand his mourning, but even in that, you get the sense that David, he's not rightly understanding why he should be mourning. Would to God that I had died for thee. No, that's not the right thing. That's not what should have happened in this. Now, like I said, we're going to see in the beginning of chapter 19, and I actually agree with Joab in this, where Joab, he's very angry. And so just to look ahead a little bit, verse 5 of chapter 19, Joab came into the house of the king, and he said, Thou hast shamed this day the faces of all thy servants, which this day have saved thy life, and the lives of thy sons and of thy daughters, and the lives of thy wives, and the lives of thy concubines, and that thou lovest thine enemies, and hatest thy friends. For thou hast declared this day that thou regardest neither princes nor servants, for this day I perceive that if Absalom had lived, and all we had died this day, then it would have pleased thee well. Right? So Joab comes in, and he really gets in David's face. He says, you got to stop what you're doing. You got to stop this mourning business, and you've got to do things the right way, because, again, you need to understand, yes, that's your son, but you're also these people's king, and they need to see you doing the right thing. And so, nevertheless, not to get ahead of ourselves, we'll talk about that next week. But like I've been saying, we understand the heartache. And so this, yes, I understand there's a fine line here. I understand the heartache. I would never take away David's mourning. We would never try to say, David, you shouldn't even be sad. You shouldn't grieve. You shouldn't mourn. No, there's a rightful place for all of that. But you have to understand the bigger things at play here, and the fact that justice was done. And as God's man, God's king for the nation of Israel, that is something that you should also very much greatly care about, that justice happened. And so to close here, I give this quote of Davis, and he just says this so well. He says, if the kingdom of God under God's chosen king is to be saved, then the enemy who assaults that kingdom must be destroyed. God gives no secure salvation to his church unless he brings decisive judgment on her enemies. I like what he says here. We must stop praying, deliver us from evil, unless we yearn for its destruction, meaning evil's destruction. He goes on to say, there will always be those, I suppose, who think it strange that there cannot be ecumenicity between Christ and Antichrist. But God's people know the Cushite is right. The preserving of God's kingdom involves the perishing of its enemies. And so we have to understand, we live in a time, in a society, where people don't like to hear those kinds of things. People don't like to think of the righteous wrath of God falling down upon his enemies. But we talk, and so I won't rehash all this. We talked about this a great deal. That if God genuinely is holy, if God genuinely is righteous, and if he actually is the judge of the world, which we believe all of these things, if all of those things are true, then he must righteously deal with evil. He must righteously punish the evildoer. And so you say, well, shouldn't we all deserve that punishment? Absolutely, we all should. And if not for his son, we all would. And so this shows understanding the veracity of God's holiness and the overwhelming nature of God's wrath against evil should make us love and understand the beauty of Calvary more. Because that's what that was. What Calvary was the veracity of God's holiness and the overwhelming nature of his wrath against unrighteousness. It's just for us, and his love and grace for us, he did it to his son and not to you and I. And so this, again, it just brings out the beauty of Calvary even more to understand this particular nature of God. And so interesting things happening here in the life of David. We'll see over the next couple of chapters, the heartache is not over for him. Again, Nathan told him the sword will not leave. Not it'll be here for a little while and then go away. No, the sword's not going to leave. And so David is not done with heartache. He's not even done losing children. And so we'll see that more as we go on. But at least with this particular incident, whatever word you want to use for it with Absalom, God has taken care of it. And so, again, what we see is God still bringing judgment against David for, as we talk about all the time, for the natural consequences of David's sin, but still keeping his promises, to David, still giving him a line of kings, still doing all the things that he said he would do, and yet still bringing this judgment. And so just a very interesting kind of back and forth with David and his life, and it's kind of a sad end to what was such a tremendously amazing beginning with David. Now he still, we see snippets of the old David, I guess you could say, throughout, but it's definitely a downward decline, I guess you could say, overall. But let me pray, and we'll be dismissed. Lord, we